Greetings and welcome to this special episode of the Mowglis Memories podcast, remembering internationally renowned philosopher Daniel Dennett and his Camp Mowglis days. If you happen to read the obituary notice about Mowglis' brother Daniel Dennett in the 2004 Mowglis Call, you'll have a pretty good synopsis of some of his most profound professional achievements. Indeed, Dan Dennett moved a lot of mountains in his professional life, but few admirers of the man who will be enshrined in the Hall of Great Philosophers will know about the life experiences that formed the very foundation of Daniel Dennett's character and outlook on life. That's why I recently took the time to track down the video of Dan's last conversation with me for the Mowglis Memories podcast, which has previously only been published as an audio podcast, in order to provide a video record of the conversation, not only for members of the Mowglis family, but even more important for the wider world. You see, the roots of the integrity, honor, and gentle but firm spirit that Daniel Dennett brought to his intellectual pursuits in adulthood can be found in the life lessons he learned at Camp Mowglis, the School of the Open. Anyone who wants to fully understand how it was that Daniel Dennett developed into the intellectual giant the world knew needs to understand what happened to Dan between 1951, when he first came to Mowglis, until 1959, his last summer there, and well beyond his summer experiences as core values that drove him throughout his life. Here's my conversation with Dan Dennett.
Hello.
Hey, there we go.
So we're trying this again.
Yeah. and now I grew a beard in honor of you. How you feeling?
I'm feeling better and better.
Good. So, Dan, I'm very sorry to have to do this again, but it also gives me a chance to fix what I didn't do, including asking you how many books have you written?
I'm not sure what the count is. Got a new one coming out this month, so it's 15 or 16 or 17, something like that.
Wow. So here I am for speaking with Dan Dennett, who is an internationally renowned philosopher and thinker, and was a Mowglis graduate. And Dan, I don't think that I asked you when we talked previously how you actually came to Mowglis.
Well, I'm pretty sure it's that my mother had found Hillside Inn, the farm inn that was just down the road between Mowglis and Onaway. And we spent a couple of weeks there the first summer we were back from Beirut, after my father died. And she heard about Mowglis then, from people there, and maybe even checked it out, and got some good recommendations for it. And so sent me off. 1951 was my first year.
51. Now, so were you born in Beirut?
No, my younger sister was born in Beirut. I was born in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
But my father was in the OSS and then the CIG, and that brought us over to Lebanon, to Beirut, where we lived in sort of diplomatic splendor while he did his spying.
Diplomatic splendor is in the Middle East is kind of an oxymoron, isn't it?
No, no, no.
No, it's
We had a house in downtown Beirut. Doesn't no longer exist. There's a office block where it is now, but it had a big, high iron fence around it, and it had a garden, and we had a 2-car garage and a yard and the side where I had a pet gazelle
wow.
named Babar. That wasn't for too long. The gazelle was not happy. It had been a gift from a Bedouin leader to my father to give to me, and America didn't have an embassy then; it had a legation, so there was no proper ambassador, but there was diplomatic attaches of all sorts. My father was one of them, but that was a cover for his job as a spy.
And did you know this all along, or did you only learn it years later?
I learned it a few years later after he died.
Uh-huh. So he died and then you moved back to the States?
That's right, in 1947.
Uh-huh.
And I was 5, and then 2 years later, I went to Mowgli.
So you were a cub when you came to
Well,
Mowgli, right?
I spent 1 or 2 nights in Cubland, and then was moved up to Baloo.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not quite sure why, I can't remember, but maybe I was seen as a little mature for my age or something, and Baloo was seen as a better place for me, which I was very happy to do.
Well, that makes that makes sense because I was wondering how you went from cubs to the den in just 5 years, and now I understand it. Now, when you moved up to Baloo was at that time the youngest dorm
Youngest one, yes.
in the pack, and it's now Tumai, and that came about as a result of uh, one year when there was a much larger group of kids that wouldn't fit into Tumai, so Mr. Bill Hart, switched them around.
Yeah, well, I went to my second year, and then to Aquila, and then to Panther,
Mm-hmm.
and then
And so what do you recall? You were, I know, from stories that I've heard from various people, you were an avid hiker. You liked to hike.
I like to hike, yes, and one of the best trips of all was actually when I was a counselor, and Ken Crowell, who was then the trip master, chose me to be one of the counselors on the first trip to Katahdin that I think the Mowgli had done for at least for many years. And that was just the best hike of all. We spent the better part of a week in Katahdin, and went to Chimney Pond, and then around to Russell Pond, Davis Pond, and then over the knife edge and home. That was fantastic.
Wow. You know, I was trip master for a number of years at Mowgli, and uh, I I was there for quite a number of years prior to that. And Katahdin was never on the list. So you were very fortunate to have
Absolutely.
done
That was
that.
one of Ken Kroll's great innovations to take us over to Katahdin.
Yeah, and Ken told me another story about you, and I don't know if it was when you were on the staff or when you were a kid, but he said that one trip, I think he said it was to the Pemmies, where it was kind of a lousy weather, and all of a sudden you and somebody else uh, uh, who knew it was his birthday surprised him with a with a cupcake that you had carried in for the occasion.
No, I don't remember that, but
You don't
I'd be happy to take
take
credit.
credit. Well, he spoke very fondly of you.
He was one of my favorite counselors.
Who else do you particularly remember in terms of your counselors?
Well, Ed Lincoln at the waterfront,
Wow.
and Ed taught me how to sail. And then later I was assistant head watermaster and with Joe Beckford, and was in charge of the sailing program. I was also in charge of the canoeing program for a while. Um, and, uh, and then those two ingenious oddballs, Slug Heffernan and T. Price Zimmerman, who put on the most amazing special days for us. Africa Day, Martian Day, and Gold Rush Day. That's when I was a camper. I remember those days vividly, all three of them.
It's interesting that you mentioned those two because we had a Zoom event where we kind of were reminiscing about crew, and both of them participated. This was maybe 2 3 weeks ago.
They were very big on the pageantry and the ceremony and the symbolism. And I remember as I recall, both of them were Blue Crew counselors, and they uh, did some spectacular uh, parades and events to celebrate. But I think we scotched them one year. We had a theme where we were the downtrodden uh, uh, natives and were being lorded over by some strange uh, icon, this great statue of a sort of seated man who was all blue, and we were enslaved by the blue. But then we rebelled, and when we pushed on this construction of 2x4 and crepe paper just right, it fell apart and it turned into a big red V. I remember that was a particularly clever bit of stagecraft by those two.
I guess so. So you were most of your years were with Colonel Elwell as the director.
Yes. Colonel Elwell was the director, and then um, Darwin Kingsley,
Mm-hmm.
and then the unlamented John Adams.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Had my friends with John Adams. He was happy to leave in the middle of the summer.
Uh-huh. Now, what was your relationship with the colonel?
I admired him tremendously. He was uh, a fine role model for me. He uh, I viewed him as a very appropriate leader for the whole place. And I remember going to Kimball Falls with him, and on a number of hiking trips, he was still able to hike around quite nimbly. Um, and he showed me one amazing thing. When it was my Aquila year, that year we were into having blood brothers. And I won't say the name of the boy. I remember it exactly, but I won't name him. I've not followed him through his life. But he was a troublemaker and always getting in trouble. But I sort of befriended him, and I agreed to be a blood brother with him. And this involved taking our jackknives and making scratches in our arms and putting our wrists together so that presumably a little blood would flow between them. That was no doubt a very unsanitary, but we all did it. Or not all of us, but many of us did. So he was my blood brother. And so I was supposed to stick up for him. He was supposed to stick up for me. Well, I can't remember what the delinquency was, some deed that in fact Peter had done. Oops, I wasn't going to tell you his first.
That's okay.
I won't tell you his last name. And I knew he'd done it, but I wasn't going to rat on him. And Colonel Elwell called me into his office, the one there in the headquarters building, that little building next to Gray Brothers. And he asked me a few questions, and I stood up for Peter. And then he had me go behind the hanging curtain into his bedroom there and just sit on the bed. He says, "Now you just be quiet." And he brought my blood brother down from Aquila and proceeded to question him. And this lad told lie after lie about me. And claimed I was responsible for all sorts of bad goings on. And Colonel just let him talk. And then after a few minutes of that, Colonel just got it from his desk chair and opened the curtain and had me walk out.
Oh.
And the look on that lad's face, and he knew that he'd just lost a friend, just lost a blood brother, and in fact, he was sent home. And I think he was the only boy that was ever sent home from Mowgli when I was there.
Huh. That was quite a lesson for you, huh?
It was quite a lesson for me. And I remember, I guess I was a bit of a show off and a cocksure kid at that point. I remember Colonel Elwell looking me in the eye and holding me sort of at arm's length with his hand around the back of my neck. I remember the strong grip of his fingers on my neck so he could look right into my eyes. And he said, "Danny," he said, you can be a leader among men if you will just rein in your arrogance," I think was maybe the word he used, or if you will just be more modest. And I've never forgotten that moment. And there have been numerous times in my life when I thought, remember what the colonel said. Just calm down and cool your engines, and things will go better.
You know,
And
it's 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 interesting that you say that because I've talked with a number of people who have who are quite familiar with you, and the one of the words that is often used, despite the fact that you are world renowned, is humble.
well, I learned my lesson well from. I guess I learned my lesson well from the colonel.
Yeah.
Um,
And I hear that you're quite a sailor. Is that true?
That's true. I fell in love with sailing under the inspiration of Ed Lincoln, and I taught sailing first at Mowgli, and then the first year we were married down at a summer place called Salter's Point in Buzzards Bay. And then when I got my first, well, in college, I crewed on a number of boats, raced a little bit, which we didn't do any of at Mowgli. And then I raced in California for 5 or 6 years on big boats, ocean going catamarans. I never did a Transpac race. I raced to Hawaii. I was invited to go several times, but I didn't trust. I was racing in catamarans, and I didn't trust myself not to fall asleep and tip us over in the middle of the ocean. I didn't trust the rest of the crew either. Those were rather unstable and fantastic crafts, but nothing to go Transpac, I think.
Mm.
And then I have spent over 40 years with a summer place on the coast of Maine, where I resumed my friendship with Ken Crow, by the way. And after crewing on a lot of other people's boats for years, I finally got a boat of my own, but only fairly recently, 2004. And raced it and cruised it and sold it, I don't know, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that. When I was getting to where I didn't think I could single-hand it comfortably, a 42-foot boat.
Yeah. Oh,
The idea is I got the biggest boat I could get that I could double hand with my wife easily and single hand in a pinch. And I was getting to the point where I didn't think I should trust myself to single hand it. Getting a little wobbly.
Now, after Mowgli, what brought you to philosophy? Or maybe including Mowgli, what brought you to philosophy?
It was in Mowgli where I learned about philosophy. One day, I've been a sort of a reflective thinking type kid forever. And one day, one of the counselors said, "Danny, I think you're going to be a philosopher." And I said, "What's that?" and he told me. I thought, well, son of a gun, you mean you can actually make a living doing this? And so I kept it in the back of my mind. And then when I got to college, I discovered that, that's what I wanted to be.
And our the director of Mowgli, Nick Robbins, I was talking with him earlier today because we were talking about somebody else that you may remember, a fellow named Jack Maresca.
I didn't know him.
He was, I think, a year older than you or 2 years older than you, maybe. But anyway, Nick was saying he was a huge admirer of you and hopes that you'll pay us a visit at Mowgli next summer, God willing, and the pandemic don't rise again.
Well, I have mixed feelings about going back to Mowgli. I did go back to Mowgli, quite a few years ago for a not a crew day, I think, but for something. Uh, so I saw that it hadn't changed much. I I don't want to see it changed. I want to remember it the way it was.
Yeah.
Uh, I uh, have uh, I have such happy memories of that place. It it was a very big part of my boyhood. I I think I may have said this to you before when we talked. When I look back at my years as a boy between the ages of 9 and 15, I remember very little what happened in fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade. But the summers, every one of those summers is full of detail. In those 8 weeks, I had experiences and memories, adventures that have never left me, even though I have sort of nothing to compare them with from my school time, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. 10 months, 10 months of school, 2 months of camp, and all I remember is camp.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of us feel that way, Dan.
One of the wonderful things about going to Mowgli was that when I went to Mowgli, I left behind all the people that I knew from my hometown. Nobody else from my town came that went to Mowgli, and I wanted to keep it that way. It meant that I could just leave all that behind and I could be a different me. I could try new things, and didn't have to live down anything or live up to anything, or I could sort of remake myself. It was the Mowgli me, and then there was the boy from Winchester, Massachusetts. They were two different kids.
Huh. Well, now that you say that, I have to say that I felt the same way. Even though, pardon me?
What years were you there?
Well, I came in 1963. It was the first summer that the Holt Elwell Foundation owned the camp.
My time, yeah.
And I was there on and off through the early 80s. So
somebody else I should mention who had a big influence on me was Garland Thayer. He was the craft counselor.
Sure.
And did you know him?
I knew Garland because Garland and his wife stayed with my late wife Alice and I when they came up for the centennial celebration.
Well, I admired him no end. He was entirely unlike any man I'd ever met. One thing, he was a man of God, and as a now notorious atheist, I haven't paid too much attention to too many men of God in my life. But there's a purity in that man's soul and the intensity of his devotion to everything: music, crafts, juggling, acrobatics, folk tales. He was this sort of all-round mountain man, sort of a wise hillbilly king. I just thought the world of him.
I don't know if you remember a fellow named Charlie Walbridge, but he talks about Garland in the same way. And have to say that I follow you in terms of religious beliefs, but I think for both of us, including you, we have an appreciation for that sort of, the spiritual aspect of people like that.
He, he was he was as good and honest and high integrity person as I think I've ever met. And he didn't make a deal of it. It just was there and you could just tell. And I remember um, when when John Adams briefly took over the camp, Garland was still there as a counselor, and it was a year when I was not there. And he wrote me he had my summer address, and he wrote me a letter in the summer telling me how terrible things were going at Mowgli and how the whole place was going downhill. And I was so saddened by that. And then the place did turn around, thanks to Bill Hart.
And thanks to your friend Joe Beckford,
Yeah.
who played a big role in bringing together the right people.
Yeah, yeah, they put it, they held it together. And I've always been grateful to them for doing that.
Yeah.
I couldn't get my son to go for one reason or another. Well, we had a place on the coast of Maine, and he was learning to sail there and swim and canoe and all that. And I couldn't get my grandson to go either, but gave them the opportunity. I would have been happy to send them to Mowgli if they'd wanted to go.
Yeah. It has a lifelong influence on us, doesn't it?
It does. Yes.
Well, Dan, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today, and I hope you will consider making a visit. You know, it really hasn't changed very much. Very, very little. You'd be,
I hope not. I just uh, my memories of the buildings and the field. Do they still do colors every night with the cannon and
yes, indeed. Yeah,
and
they sure do.
Call and
Yeah, and this year they became they became uh, I guess registered on the National Historic Registry. So I don't think you'll see a whole lot of changes over the years, even to the buildings, because you know how strict those standards are when something becomes a National Historic Site.
well, that's great. Um, yeah, that reminds me. I mentioned the I love the bugle calls and the uh, learning how to do how to line up and parade rest and tension and saluting the flag. Eh, That was I never was in the army. I would have made a terrible soldier, but discipline that discipline was a very good thing at that time in my life, and I often retrospectively appreciated it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hope you'll come back and maybe we'll have a chance to see each other.
That would be very nice.
Again, thank you very much, Dan Dennett. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, I'm delighted and put this to good use, I hope.
You bet. You bet. And I'll send you a link.
Okay.
You take care. Bye.
Bye.